The story of Atlantis begins not in the mists of prehistory, but in the 4th century BCE, in the philosophical writings of Plato, one of ancient Greece's greatest thinkers. Plato introduced Atlantis in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. These weren't adventure stories or mythology in the traditional sense, but philosophical texts that used storytelling as a vehicle for exploring ideas about ideal societies, divine justice, and human hubris. In these dialogues, Plato presents the story through a chain of transmission. The tale is told by Critias, who claims to have heard it from his grandfather, also named Critias, who heard it from Solon, one of Athens' great lawgivers. Solon, in turn, supposedly learned the story during his travels to Egypt, where Egyptian priests in the city of Sais shared with him an ancient history unknown to the Greeks. This careful attribution to historical figures was important because Plato wanted his audience to consider the story seriously, at least as a thought experiment. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place it approximately 11,000 years before our present day. The island was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. This was, to ancient Greeks, the edge of the known world, a mysterious realm beyond civilization's reach. The island itself was enormous, described as larger than Libya and Asia combined, though it's worth noting that Asia to the ancient Greeks meant Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Atlantis was said to be a land of incredible natural wealth and beauty. It had abundant natural resources including precious metals, timber, and exotic animals. The climate was perfect, allowing for multiple harvests each year. Mountains protected the interior from northern winds, while warm springs provided fresh water throughout the island. But what truly set Atlantis apart was its capital city, also called Atlantis, which represented the pinnacle of ancient engineering and architecture. Plato describes the city in remarkable detail. At its center was a hill where the god Poseidon had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, Poseidon carved the hill into alternating rings of land and water, 3 rings of water and 2 of land, perfectly concentric and of equal width. The Atlanteans, descendants of Poseidon and Cleito's 5 sets of twin sons, expanded on this divine foundation. They built bridges across the rings of water and dug a canal from the sea to the outermost ring, allowing ships to sail into the heart of the city. The rings of land were fortified with walls made of stone quarried from beneath the central island, some naturally white, some black, and some red, creating a striking visual effect. These walls weren't merely defensive structures. The Atlanteans covered them with metals, the outermost wall coated with brass, the inner wall with tin, and the wall around the citadel with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as shining like fire and being second in value only to gold. Whether orichalcum was a real metal or a symbolic element of the story remains debated to this day, with some suggesting it might have been an alloy of copper and gold, while others see it as purely allegorical. The central island housed the royal palace and the great temple of Poseidon. The temple was a magnificent structure, with an exterior covered in silver except for the pinnacles, which were golden. Inside, the ceiling was made of ivory decorated with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The temple contained a massive golden statue of Poseidon standing in a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling. Around him stood 100 golden statues of Nereids riding dolphins. The city's infrastructure was equally impressive. The outer ring of land served as a military zone, with barracks and training grounds. The inner ring contained gardens and gymnasia. Everywhere, the Atlanteans had constructed elaborate systems of hot and cold springs, public baths, and fountains. They had built race courses where they held competitions, and harbors filled with triremes and merchants from around the world. Beyond the city proper, the rest of the island was divided into a geometric plain, surrounded by mountains. This plain measured 3,000 by 2,000 stadia in ancient Greek measurements, which translates to approximately 370 by 230 miles, or 600 by 370 kilometers. It was irrigated by an intricate network of canals fed by streams flowing down from the mountains. The Atlanteans divided the plain into 60,000 lots, each providing a certain number of men for the military. The Atlantean civilization was organized as a confederation of 10 kingdoms, ruled by the descendants of Poseidon's 10 sons. The eldest line, descending from Atlas, the firstborn son, held supreme authority over the others. Every 5 or 6 years, the kings would gather in the temple of Poseidon to discuss matters of state and to judge any member of the royal family who had violated their ancestral laws. These laws, Plato tells us, were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple. The ceremonies surrounding these gatherings were elaborate and ritualistic. The kings would sacrifice a bull, mixing its blood with wine and pouring it over the inscription as they swore oaths to uphold the laws. They would then sit in judgment, dressed in splendid blue robes, and render decisions by firelight, extinguishing the flames in the temple as dawn approached. For many generations, the Atlanteans remained true to their divine heritage. They valued wisdom and virtue above material wealth, even though they possessed riches beyond measure. They treated their prosperity with indifference, recognizing it as less important than virtue and mutual goodwill. Their government was just, their society harmonious, and their lives blessed by the gods. But as time passed and many generations came and went, the divine portion of their nature became diluted by repeated admixture with mortal stock. Human nature gained the upper hand. The Atlanteans began to lose their spiritual qualities and became consumed by ambition and greed. Where they had once been noble and wise, they now became corrupt and power-hungry. They began to seek domination over other peoples, building a massive military force with the goal of conquering the known world. According to Plato's narrative, Atlantis succeeded in conquering much of the Mediterranean world. Their armies swept through Libya as far as Egypt, and through Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, modern-day Tuscany. Only Athens stood in their way. In Plato's telling, ancient Athens represented the ideal state he had described in his earlier work, the Republic. The Athenians, though vastly outnumbered, defeated the Atlantean forces through their superior virtue and military skill, liberating the conquered peoples and preventing Atlantis from enslaving the entire Mediterranean world. But then came the divine judgment. Zeus, king of the gods, seeing how the once noble Atlanteans had become corrupt and deciding to punish them, called the gods together to decide their fate. Here, frustratingly, Plato's dialogue Critias breaks off mid-sentence. We never learn what punishment Zeus decreed. However, in the earlier dialogue Timaeus, Plato had already revealed the ending. Catastrophic earthquakes and floods occurred, and in a single day and night, Atlantis sank beneath the waves, disappearing forever into the ocean depths. To understand the story of Atlantis, we must understand Plato's purposes in writing it. Plato was not a historian or geographer, but a philosopher deeply concerned with questions of ethics, politics, and the ideal society. The dialogues containing the Atlantis story were written during a period when Plato was developing his most mature political philosophy. In the Republic, written before Timaeus and Critias, Plato had outlined his vision of an ideal state governed by philosopher kings, with a rigid class structure and communal living for the guardian class. The Atlantis story appears to serve multiple philosophical purposes within this broader context. First, it presents ancient Athens as a real-world example of his ideal republic in action, demonstrating that such a state could actually exist and successfully defend itself against overwhelming odds. The destruction was absolute. Not only did Atlantis vanish, but the Athenian army that had defeated them also perished in the same cataclysm. The sea where Atlantis had been became impassable, choked with mud and shallow waters, making that part of the ocean unnavigable for ships. This was Plato's complete account of Atlantis, a tale of a great civilization that rose to incredible heights, but fell to corruption and was destroyed by divine retribution. Second, Atlantis itself serves as a cautionary tale about the corruption that comes from abandoning virtue in favor of material wealth and imperial ambition. The Atlanteans begin as an ideal society, blessed by the gods and living in harmony with divine law. But as they intermarry with mortals and their divine nature becomes diluted, they lose sight of their higher purpose. They mistake their prosperity for proof of their superiority and use their wealth and power to dominate others. This trajectory from virtue to vice, from divine favor to divine punishment, embodies one of Plato's central philosophical themes. Third, the story functions as a vehicle for Plato's cosmological and theological ideas. In the Timaeus dialogue, the Atlantis story serves as a prelude to a much longer discourse on the creation of the universe, the nature of the soul, and the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms. The rise and fall of Atlantis demonstrates the operation of divine justice in human affairs and the inevitable consequences of straying from virtue. Many scholars believe that Plato never intended Atlantis to be understood as a literal, historical place. The symmetry of the city's design, with its perfect concentric circles, seems too geometrically ideal to be natural. The precise numbers in the account, the elaborate genealogies, and the convenient moral lessons all suggest a carefully constructed philosophical allegory rather than a historical record. The fact that the Critias dialogue breaks off unfinished, right at the moment when Zeus is about to pronounce judgment, might indicate that Plato himself lost interest in the story once it had served its philosophical purpose. However, other evidence suggests Plato may have based his story on real historical or geographical knowledge, even if he embellished it for philosophical purposes. The detailed descriptions of the city's layout, the specific measurements, and the references to real places like Egypt and the Pillars of Hercules all suggest that Plato was trying to ground his story in a quasi-historical framework. He explicitly has his characters insist that the story is true, not a fable, though this insistence itself might be part of the literary device. How did Plato's contemporaries and immediate successors receive the Atlantis story? The evidence is limited but intriguing. Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, apparently regarded the story as fiction invented by his teacher. A later commentator reports that Aristotle said, "The man who dreamed it up made it vanish," suggesting he saw Atlantis as Plato's invention. However, we don't have Aristotle's actual words on the subject, only this secondhand report. Other ancient philosophers took the story more seriously as historical fact. Crantor, a philosopher who wrote a commentary on the Timaeus in the 4th century BCE, claimed to have seen the original pillars in Egypt where the story was inscribed, though no other source corroborates this claim. Plutarch, the famous biographer and philosopher who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, mentions Atlantis in passing as a real place, though he doesn't elaborate. Perhaps the most significant ancient commentary on Atlantis comes from Proclus, a Neoplatonist philosopher of the 5th century CE. In his extensive commentary on the Timaeus, Proclus argues that Atlantis was real, citing various ancient authorities and attempting to explain how such a civilization could have existed and vanished without leaving more obvious traces. His work helped keep the Atlantis story alive and gave it philosophical credibility in late antiquity. Strabo, the Greek geographer who lived around the time of Christ, mentions Atlantis in his geography. He seems uncertain about whether to believe the story, noting that some people accept Plato's account while others reject it entirely. He doesn't commit to either position, suggesting that educated opinion in his time was divided on the question. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist who perished in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, mentions islands in the Atlantic that might be remnants of Atlantis, though he doesn't explicitly identify them as such. This shows that the idea of Atlantic islands with connections to lost civilizations was circulating in the ancient Roman world. What's particularly interesting about the ancient reception of Atlantis is the relative lack of attention it received. While Plato's philosophical works were enormously influential in antiquity, the Atlantis story was rarely discussed or elaborated upon. It wasn't until much later, particularly in the modern era, that Atlantis captured the popular imagination in the way we see today. In ancient times, it was primarily a philosophical curiosity, one story among many in Plato's rich corpus of dialogues. During the Middle Ages, the story of Atlantis nearly vanished from Western consciousness. Plato's works were less studied in medieval Europe than those of Aristotle, and the specific dialogues containing the Atlantis story were not widely available in Latin translation. Medieval scholars were more interested in biblical history and Christian theology than in pagan philosophical tales about lost civilizations. When medieval writers did encounter references to Atlantis, they often tried to incorporate it into biblical chronology. Some suggested that Atlantis might have been a pre-flood civilization destroyed in Noah's deluge. Others identified it with various legendary islands mentioned in medieval geography, such as the Islands of the Blessed or the mythical island of Brazil that appeared on medieval maps off the coast of Ireland. These interpretations reflect the medieval tendency to synthesize classical learning with Christian doctrine. The situation changed dramatically during the Renaissance. The rediscovery and translation of Plato's complete works in the 15th century made the Atlantis story accessible to a much wider audience. Marsilio Ficino, the great Italian philosopher and translator, produced the first complete Latin translation of Plato in 1484, which included both Timaeus and Critias. This translation sparked renewed interest in Atlantis among European intellectuals. The timing was perfect. European explorers were discovering new lands across the Atlantic Ocean, finding civilizations and peoples previously unknown to Europe. The discovery of the Americas, in particular, seemed to suggest that Plato's story might have some basis in fact. If unknown civilizations existed across the Atlantic, why couldn't Atlantis have existed there as well? This question would obsess thinkers for centuries to come. Christopher Columbus himself may have been influenced by the Atlantis story. Some historians suggest that classical accounts of Atlantic islands helped inspire his belief that land lay across the ocean. Whether or not Columbus specifically thought he would find Atlantis, the classical geographical tradition that included Atlantis certainly helped shape European ideas about what might lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Spaniard Francisco López de Gomara, writing in the mid-16th century, explicitly suggested that the Americas might be Atlantis. In his history of the Spanish conquests, he noted the similarities between Plato's description and the newly discovered lands. Both were large islands or continents beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Both had advanced civilizations, and both were previously unknown to Europeans. This identification of Atlantis with America would become extremely popular and persist for centuries. The English philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon took this idea even further. In his unfinished utopian novel, The New Atlantis, published in 1626, Bacon imagined a perfect society located on an island in the Pacific Ocean. His fictional nation of Bensalem was explicitly connected to the Atlantis tradition, though Bacon made it clear that his Atlantis was in the Pacific, not the Atlantic. Bacon's work used the Atlantis motif to explore ideas about scientific progress, social organization, and the role of knowledge in creating an ideal society. It was enormously influential and helped cement Atlantis in the popular imagination as a symbol of advanced civilization and lost wisdom. Meanwhile, scholars were attempting more systematic analyses of Plato's account. The Swedish scholar Olaus Rudbeck, in his massive work Atlantica published between 1679 and 1702, argued that Atlantis was actually Sweden and that Swedish was the original language of Adam in the Garden of Eden. While this seems absurd today, Rudbeck's work was taken seriously by many of his contemporaries. He attempted to use linguistic evidence, mythology, and geography to prove his case, pioneering methods that later Atlantis researchers would adopt, though usually with different conclusions. The Renaissance and early modern period also saw the development of a hermetic and mystical tradition surrounding Atlantis. Esoteric philosophers began to incorporate Atlantis into their cosmologies, presenting it as a source of ancient wisdom and secret knowledge. The Atlanteans were imagined as possessors of advanced spiritual and magical powers, knowledge that had been lost with the sinking of their island, but might be recoverable through proper study and spiritual practice. This mystical interpretation of Atlantis would become extremely important in later centuries, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. What's notable about this period is how Atlantis began to separate from its original context in Plato's philosophy. While Plato had used the story to explore questions about virtue, corruption, and ideal government, Renaissance and early modern thinkers increasingly treated it as a historical or geographical puzzle to be solved. The moral dimension of the story receded as the factual question became paramount. Did Atlantis really exist? And if so, where was it? The modern fascination with Atlantis truly began in 1882 with the publication of Atlantis, The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and amateur scientist. Donnelly's book was a sensation, becoming an international bestseller and single-handedly transforming Atlantis from an obscure philosophical dialogue into a cultural phenomenon. Even today, many popular ideas about Atlantis can be traced directly to Donnelly's influential work. Donnelly approached Atlantis not as philosophy or allegory, but as historical and scientific fact. He accepted Plato's account as essentially accurate reporting of real events and set out to prove it using the scientific knowledge of his day. His central thesis was that Atlantis had been a real island continent in the Atlantic Ocean, the original seat of human civilization, from which culture, agriculture, and technology spread to both the Old World and the New. In Donnelly's reconstruction, Atlantis was the source of all ancient civilizations. He argued that the similarities between Egyptian and Mesoamerican pyramids, the shared flood myths in cultures around the world, and the linguistic connections between Old and New World languages all pointed to a common origin in Atlantis. When Atlantis was destroyed in a catastrophic event, survivors fled to different parts of the world, carrying their advanced knowledge with them and giving rise to the ancient civilizations we know from history. Donnelly marshaled an impressive array of evidence for his theory, or at least what seemed like evidence to readers in the late 19th century. He pointed to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a mountain range running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, as the possible location of Atlantis, with the modern Atlantic islands like the Azores being the mountain peaks of the sunken continent. He cited deep-sea soundings that had recently revealed the ocean floor's topography, arguing that the Atlantic had once been much shallower and could have supported an island continent. Nevertheless, Donnelly's book had an enormous impact. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and went through numerous editions. It inspired countless imitators and spawned an entire genre of pseudo-archaeological literature. It transformed Atlantis from a philosophical curiosity into a staple of popular culture. For millions of readers, Donnelly's Atlantis was real, a magnificent lost civilization whose rediscovery would revolutionize our understanding of human history. Following Donnelly, other writers developed increasingly elaborate theories about Atlantis. Lewis Spence, a Scottish journalist, published several books in the 1920s arguing that Atlantis had been a chain of islands in the Atlantic rather than a single continent. He tried to use more rigorous anthropological and archaeological evidence than Donnelly, though his conclusions were still rejected by mainstream scholars. Spence proposed that Atlantis had been the source of the Cro-Magnon people who had brought advanced culture to Europe at the end of the last ice age. He examined plants and animals, noting species that appeared on both sides of the Atlantic and arguing this indicated a former land bridge. He analyzed mythology, pointing to flood legends, stories of lost paradises, and tales of advanced ancient peoples in cultures around the world as distorted memories of Atlantis. He looked at language, trying to find common roots between European and American Indian languages that might indicate a shared Atlantean origin. He even argued that the Garden of Eden, the Elysian Fields, the Gardens of the Hesperides, and other mythological paradises were all dim memories of Atlantis. Donnelly's work was remarkably comprehensive and persuasive to general readers, even though professional scientists and scholars were skeptical from the start. The problem was that Donnelly, while enthusiastic and industrious, wasn't properly trained in any of the scientific fields he was drawing upon. His interpretations of geological evidence were based on outdated theories about land subsidence. His linguistic comparisons were superficial and based on coincidental similarities rather than rigorous philological analysis. His mythological interpretations read connections into stories that could be explained in much simpler ways. Meanwhile, Atlantis was being incorporated into various mystical and occult traditions. Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, made Atlantis central to her elaborate spiritual cosmology. In her massive work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, she described Atlantis as the home of the fourth root race of humanity, succeeded by our current fifth root race. The Atlanteans, in her account, possessed tremendous psychic and magical powers, but fell into decadence and black magic, leading to their destruction. Blavatsky claimed to have learned about Atlantis from ancient Tibetan texts and through direct spiritual revelation. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic known as the Sleeping Prophet, made hundreds of references to Atlantis in his trance readings during the 1920s through 1940s. According to Cayce, Atlantis was an advanced civilization with technology surpassing our own, including aircraft, submarines, and mysterious energy crystals. He claimed that Atlantis was destroyed in 3 separate cataclysms spanning thousands of years, with the final destruction occurring around 10,000 BCE. Cayce predicted that Atlantis would rise again in 1968 or 1969, a prophecy that obviously failed to materialize, though some of his followers claimed that the discovery of the Bimini Road underwater rock formation near the Bahamas in 1968 partially fulfilled the prediction. These mystical interpretations of Atlantis shared several common features. They portrayed Atlantis as technologically and spiritually superior to modern civilization. They claimed that Atlantean knowledge had been preserved in secret traditions and might be recovered through spiritual practices or the discovery of hidden texts. They often incorporated racial theories, describing the Atlanteans as a superior race whose descendants could be found in various modern populations. And they universally rejected mainstream scientific skepticism about Atlantis in favor of alternative sources of knowledge, ancient texts, spiritual revelation, or esoteric traditions. The early 20th century also saw Atlantis appropriated for more sinister purposes. Nazi mystics incorporated Atlantis into their racial ideology, identifying the Atlanteans with the mythical Aryan race and using the Atlantis story to support their claims of Nordic racial superiority. These interpretations, while completely unfounded and morally repugnant, demonstrate how malleable the Atlantis story had become, capable of being adapted to support virtually any ideological agenda. While popularizers and mystics were building elaborate theories about Atlantis, mainstream science was developing a very different understanding of Earth's geological history, an understanding that left no room for a sunken continent in the Atlantic Ocean. The theory of plate tectonics, developed over the course of the 20th century, revolutionized our understanding of how continents form, move, and interact, and it definitively ruled out the possibility of Donnelly-style Atlantis. Plate tectonics reveals that Earth's outer shell consists of large plates of rock that float on the partially molten mantle beneath. These plates move slowly over millions of years, carrying continents with them, colliding to form mountain ranges, and pulling apart to create ocean basins. The Atlantic Ocean exists because the Eurasian and African plates are moving away from the North and South American plates, a process that began about 200 million years ago when the supercontinent Pangaea started breaking apart. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which Donnelly identified as the possible location of Atlantis, is actually the boundary where new oceanic crust is being formed as the plates pull apart. Far from being the remnant of a sunken continent, it's a place where the ocean floor is being created. The ridge rises above sea level in a few places, forming islands like Iceland, which are volcanic in origin and have never been part of any continent. Extensive geological surveys of the Atlantic Ocean floor have revealed its structure in detail. There is simply no evidence of sunken continental crust in the Atlantic. The ocean floor consists of basaltic rock characteristic of ocean crust, not the granitic rock that forms continents. If a continent had sunk in the Atlantic within the last 12,000 years, as Plato's timeline suggests, there would be unmistakable geological evidence. We would find continental-type rocks, disturbed sediment layers, and evidence of catastrophic geological activity on a scale that would have left traces around the entire Atlantic basin. No such evidence exists. Furthermore, the mechanism for such a catastrophic sinking is geologically implausible. Continents float on the denser mantle rock like icebergs on water. For a continent to sink, it would need to become denser than the mantle, which doesn't happen in nature. Continents can be partially submerged by rising sea levels, which has happened many times in Earth's history, but they don't simply drop into the ocean floor. The only way to truly submerge continental crust is through tectonic subduction, a process that takes tens of millions of years and occurs in very specific geological settings, none of which exist in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The sea level history of Earth is also well understood. During the last ice age, which ended about 11,700 years ago, sea levels were indeed much lower than today because so much water was locked up in continental ice sheets. At the glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than present. This exposed significant areas of what is now shallow seabed, creating land bridges between continents and enlarging coastal areas. However, this didn't create any large islands or continents in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where the water is several kilometers deep. When the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose relatively rapidly, in geological terms. This process, called meltwater pulse events, saw sea levels rise several meters in just a few centuries, flooding coastal areas around the world. Some researchers have suggested that memories of these flooding events, which would have displaced coastal populations and submerged settlements, might have contributed to widespread flood myths, including possibly Plato's Atlantis story. However, this doesn't support the existence of a mid-Atlantic continent. It simply explains why stories of catastrophic floods are common in ancient cultures. Archaeological evidence also contradicts the Donnelly model of Atlantis as the mother civilization of all ancient cultures. We now have an excellent understanding of how ancient civilizations developed independently in different parts of the world. Egyptian civilization arose in the Nile Valley, Mesopotamian civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the Indus Valley civilization in South Asia, Chinese civilization along the Yellow River, and Mesoamerican civilizations in Mexico and Central America. Each of these civilizations has a clear archaeological record showing gradual development from earlier cultures, with no need to invoke a common Atlantean source. The similarities between these civilizations that Donnelly pointed to, such as pyramid building, can be explained much more simply. Pyramids are a fairly obvious architectural solution to the problem of building large, stable structures with primitive technology. A stepped or sloped structure is inherently more stable than a vertical one and allows construction to greater heights without advanced engineering. The fact that cultures around the world independently developed similar solutions to similar problems doesn't require a common origin. It's an example of parallel development driven by similar constraints and opportunities. Similarly, flood myths are common in cultures around the world, not because they all remember Atlantis, but because floods are common natural disasters that affect human societies everywhere. Floods are particularly significant in agricultural societies dependent on river valleys, which describes most ancient civilizations. A culture that experiences periodic devastating floods will naturally incorporate flood stories into its mythology. The biblical flood, the Mesopotamian flood epic of Gilgamesh, the Greek flood of Deucalion, and the various floods in other mythologies likely all have local origins in actual flood events, not a shared memory of a global cataclysm. From a scientific standpoint, then, Atlantis, as described by Donnelly and his followers, simply cannot have existed. A continent in the Atlantic Ocean 12,000 years ago is geologically impossible. An advanced global civilization at that time leaving no archaeological trace is archaeologically implausible. The apparent evidence for Atlantis cited by believers either reflects misunderstandings of science or can be explained in much simpler ways that don't require a lost continent. However, this scientific consensus against a literal Atlantis hasn't settled the question of whether Plato's story might have been inspired by real events. Many researchers have proposed alternative interpretations that try to reconcile Plato's account with scientific reality by suggesting he was describing something real, just not a mid-Atlantic continent destroyed 9,000 years before his time. If Atlantis wasn't a continent in the Atlantic Ocean, might it have been something else? Could Plato's story preserve a distorted memory of a real place and real events, even if the details are exaggerated or mislocated? Many researchers have proposed alternative candidates for Atlantis, searching for historical civilizations or catastrophic events that might have inspired Plato's tale. Some of these theories are more plausible than others, but all face the challenge of reconciling Plato's specific details with their proposed location. The most popular and scientifically credible alternative is that Atlantis was inspired by the Bronze Age Minoan civilization on the island of Crete and the catastrophic eruption of the volcano on the nearby island of Thera, modern Santorini. This theory was first proposed by Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinaios in 1939 and has been developed by numerous scholars since then. The Minoan civilization flourished on Crete from roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE and was indeed a sophisticated Bronze Age culture. The Minoans built elaborate palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and other sites. They developed a writing system, conducted extensive maritime trade throughout the Mediterranean, and created remarkable works of art. Their palaces featured advanced engineering including multi-story buildings, sophisticated plumbing systems with running water and drainage, and storage facilities for managing surplus agricultural production. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, about 70 miles north of Crete, erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. The eruption was catastrophic, blowing apart most of the island and creating a massive tsunami that swept across the Mediterranean. The volcanic ash from the eruption has been found in ice cores from Greenland and sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean, testimony to the eruption's tremendous scale. The theory suggests that this eruption and its aftermath might have inspired the Atlantis story. The tsunami would have devastated coastal settlements on Crete and surrounding islands. The ash fallout would have disrupted agriculture. The psychological impact of such a disaster would have been enormous, creating memories and stories that might have been transmitted through oral tradition to later generations. By the time these stories reached Egypt and eventually Plato, they might have been greatly exaggerated and distorted, transforming a real Bronze Age disaster into the tale of a continent sinking in a day and night. The Minoan-Thera theory has several points in its favor. The timing works if we assume Plato or his sources multiplied the actual time by a factor of 10, turning 900 years into 9,000 years, which would place the events in roughly the right period for the Thera eruption. The description of a sophisticated island civilization with advanced architecture and engineering matches what we know of the Minoans. The sudden destruction by earthquake and flood matches the effects of a massive volcanic eruption and tsunami. Even the circular harbor design of Atlantis might reflect the circular volcanic caldera created by the Thera eruption. However, the theory also has significant problems. Thera is in the Aegean Sea, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, as Plato clearly states. The island wasn't larger than Libya and Asia combined, but quite small. There's no evidence of a war between the Minoans and prehistoric Athens as described in Plato's account. The Minoan civilization didn't actually sink beneath the waves. Crete is still there, and while Minoan culture did eventually decline, it was a gradual process, not a sudden catastrophe. If Plato was describing the Minoan eruption, he got almost all the geographic and historical details wrong. Another prominent theory places Atlantis in the Mediterranean at the site of ancient Troy. This idea suggests that Plato based his story on traditions about the Trojan War, transforming the siege of Troy into the war between Athens and Atlantis. Troy was certainly a real place, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, and extensively studied since then. It was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, with one major destruction layer dating to around 1200 BCE, possibly corresponding to the Trojan War described in Homer's Iliad. But Troy as Atlantis faces even greater difficulties than the Minoan theory. Troy wasn't an island, didn't sink into the sea, wasn't beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and doesn't match Plato's description of Atlantis's size, wealth, or political organization. The only real similarity is that both Troy and Atlantis were defeated in war by Greek forces, which is hardly a unique enough parallel to establish a connection. Some researchers have proposed that Atlantis was located in the Strait of Gibraltar itself. The Spanish researcher Adolf Schulten suggested in the 1920s that Atlantis was actually Tartessos, a wealthy trading city that existed in southern Spain during the first millennium BCE. Tartessos was famous in ancient sources for its mineral wealth, particularly silver, and conducted extensive trade with the Phoenicians and Greeks. The city's location has never been definitively identified, and it apparently declined and disappeared sometime in the 6th century BCE, possibly due to silting of its harbor or conquest by the Carthaginians. The Tartessos theory is intriguing because it places Atlantis near the Pillars of Hercules, as Plato describes. However, Tartessos was a mainland city, not an island. It didn't sink beneath the waves, and it existed long after Plato's supposed date for Atlantis. The theory requires us to assume that Plato or his sources greatly exaggerated the city's age, size, and the manner of its disappearance. More recently, some researchers have proposed locations for Atlantis as far afield as Antarctica, Indonesia, the Black Sea, and even Bolivia. The Antarctica theory suggests that the continent now buried under ice was once Atlantis, with the catastrophe being not the sinking of the land, but the freezing of the climate and growth of ice sheets. This theory requires accepting that advanced human civilization existed in Antarctica millions of years ago, which contradicts all evidence about both climate history and human evolution. The Indonesia theory, promoted by journalist Aricio Santos, suggests that Atlantis was located in the region of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, which was indeed a large exposed landmass during the Ice Age that was subsequently flooded by rising sea levels. While it's true that significant areas were submerged in this region, the theory requires completely ignoring Plato's explicit statement that Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean, not the Pacific. And there's no evidence of the kind of advanced civilization Plato describes in prehistoric Southeast Asia. The Black Sea theory, proposed by various researchers including Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the wreck of the Titanic, suggests that memories of catastrophic flooding in the Black Sea region around 5600 BCE might have contributed to Atlantis legends. According to this theory, the Black Sea was once a smaller freshwater lake until rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the Bosphorus, causing a massive flood that rapidly expanded the lake into the sea we know today. This event might have destroyed settlements around the former lakeshore and created flood memories that eventually contributed to various mythologies. The Black Sea flooding is a real geological event supported by evidence, though the exact timing and rapidity of the flood are still debated. However, connecting it to Atlantis requires assuming that a local flooding event in the Black Sea region somehow became transformed into Plato's story about an Atlantic island, which seems like a stretch given how different the actual event is from Plato's description. All of these alternative theories share a common pattern. They identify some real place or event that has one or two features in common with Plato's account, then argue that Plato's story is a distorted version of that reality. The problem is that to make these theories work, we have to assume that almost everything in Plato's account is wrong. Wrong location, wrong time period, wrong size, wrong description of the disaster, or some combination of these errors. At some point, we have to ask whether it makes more sense to believe that Plato was describing something real that he got almost entirely wrong, or whether he was simply inventing a fictional setting for his philosophical purposes. The search for physical evidence of Atlantis has generated numerous claims of discovery over the years. Some have been honest misinterpretations of natural or archaeological features, while others have been deliberate hoaxes. Understanding these cases helps illustrate both the appeal of Atlantis and the problems with trying to find it. One of the most famous alleged discoveries is the Bimini Road, found in shallow waters near the Bahamas in 1968. The formation consists of rectangular limestone blocks arranged in what appears to be a linear pattern extending for about half a mile. When it was discovered, some researchers, including followers of Edgar Cayce, who had predicted Atlantis would rise in 1968, claimed it was an ancient road or wall built by the Atlanteans. Geological investigations have shown that the Bimini Road is almost certainly a natural formation. The blocks are beach rock, a type of limestone that forms naturally in tropical coastal environments when beach sediments are cemented together by calcium carbonate. The regular pattern of the blocks results from natural fracturing along joints in the rock. Similar formations are found throughout the Bahamas and other tropical regions. There's no evidence of tool marks, mortar, or other signs of human construction. Nevertheless, some enthusiasts continue to argue that Bimini Road is artificial, demonstrating how difficult it can be to dislodge a cherished belief, even in the face of scientific evidence. In 2011, a team of researchers claimed to have found Atlantis buried in marshlands of southern Spain, using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar. The site, in Doñana National Park north of Cadiz, showed what they interpreted as concentric circles matching Plato's description of Atlantis. They suggested it had been destroyed by a tsunami sometime between 800 and 500 BCE. While the research team's methods were scientific and their identification of an ancient tsunami in the region is likely correct, their interpretation of the site as Atlantis is highly controversial. The circular features they identified could be natural geological formations or unrelated archaeological sites. No excavations have confirmed the presence of a major ancient city at the location. The timing doesn't match Plato's account, and Spain is not beyond the Pillars of Hercules but next to them. Most archaeologists familiar with the region believe the claims are overblown and that the researchers are seeing what they want to see in ambiguous evidence. Over the years, various underwater formations around the world have been claimed as Atlantean ruins. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, a series of underwater rock formations with geometric features, has been identified by some as a sunken city. Mainstream geologists believe it's a natural formation sculpted by erosion and tectonic activity, though some Japanese researchers argue for at least some human modification of the site. Even if it were artificial, it has no connection to Plato's Atlantis, being on the wrong side of the world and having no features matching Plato's description. Similar claims have been made about underwater formations near Cuba, in the Mediterranean, and in various other locations. In almost every case, detailed investigation has revealed natural geological formations, sometimes modified by human activity in historical times, but nothing resembling the advanced prehistoric civilization described in the Atlantis legend. The pattern is always the same. An anomalous underwater feature is discovered. It's quickly labeled as Atlantis in the media. Serious investigation reveals a much more mundane explanation, and enthusiasts move on to the next candidate. Part of the problem is that the ocean floor is poorly mapped compared to land surfaces. Until recently, we had better maps of the surface of Mars than of much of the ocean floor. This lack of detailed knowledge creates space for speculation. When sonar or satellite imagery reveals unusual features on the seafloor, it's tempting to interpret them as artificial structures rather than natural formations. The reality is that geology produces many features that can look artificial to the untrained eye. Straight lines, right angles, even circular or rectangular shapes can all occur naturally. Moreover, the ocean does contain many real archaeological sites that have been submerged by rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age. Ancient ports, settlements, and even whole landscapes now lie underwater around the world. These are genuine archaeological treasures that tell us about past human civilizations. But they're not Atlantis. They're the remains of known historical cultures that were simply located in areas later flooded by sea level rise. Finding a submerged ancient port city doesn't mean you found Atlantis any more than finding any other ancient city does. While scientists and scholars have generally dismissed Atlantis as either fictional or impossible to identify with any certainty, the legend has had an enormous impact on popular culture. From literature to film, from music to video games, Atlantis has become one of the most enduring mythological concepts in Western civilization. Understanding this cultural impact helps explain why the legend persists despite scientific skepticism. In literature, Atlantis has inspired countless works. Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870, features a visit to the underwater ruins of Atlantis, one of the earliest examples of Atlantis in science fiction. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote The Maricot Deep in 1929, which features a discovery of Atlantis on the ocean floor, with survivors still living there. C.S. Lewis used Atlantis as inspiration for his fictional civilization of Numenor in his legendarium that eventually led to the Lord of the Rings mythology. In more recent decades, Atlantis has appeared in numerous fantasy and science fiction novels. David Gibbons's Atlantis series presents Atlantis as a real ancient civilization with connections to various historical mysteries. A.G. Riddle's The Atlantis Gene launches a techno-thriller series that connects Atlantis to ancient aliens and human evolution. Marion Zimmer Bradley's Atlantis Chronicles reimagines the legend from a feminist perspective. The list goes on, with new Atlantis novels appearing regularly. Comic books and graphic novels have featured Atlantis extensively. In DC Comics, Atlantis is the underwater kingdom ruled by Aquaman, reimagined as a technologically advanced civilization that sank and adapted to life beneath the waves. Marvel Comics has its own Atlantis, home to Namor the Submariner. These comic book versions of Atlantis have become iconic in their own right, introducing the legend to new generations of readers who might never encounter Plato's original story. Film and television have perhaps done more than any other medium to keep Atlantis in the public consciousness. Disney's animated film Atlantis, The Lost Empire in 2001 presented a visually stunning version of the lost city discovered by early 20th century explorers. The film, while not historically accurate, introduced millions of children to the Atlantis legend. The Stargate franchise featured multiple episodes and story arcs involving Atlantis reimagined as an advanced alien city. The BBC series Atlantis, which ran from 2013 to 2015, created a fantasy version of the city populated by characters from Greek mythology. Documentaries about Atlantis have been popular for decades, often presenting the search for Atlantis as an ongoing scientific quest. Some of these documentaries are serious attempts to examine the evidence and theories objectively. Others, particularly those appearing on channels like the History Channel, often present fringe theories as if they have scientific credibility, contributing to public confusion about what is and isn't supported by evidence. Video games have embraced Atlantis as a setting for adventure and exploration. The Age of Mythology expansion. The Titans includes Atlantis as a playable civilization. The Tomb Raider series has featured Atlantis in multiple games. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, released in 1992, remains a classic adventure game. Assassin's Creed Odyssey includes Atlantis as a major location in its DLC content. These games allow players to explore virtual versions of Atlantis, making the legend interactive and participatory in ways that books and films cannot. Music has also drawn inspiration from Atlantis. Donovan's 1968 song Atlantis became a hit, with its memorable spoken-word opening recounting the legend. Progressive rock bands like Yes and Symphony X have written songs about Atlantis. Film soundtracks featuring Atlantis themes have become popular in their own right. The legend's association with lost beauty and vanished glory makes it a natural subject for musical interpretation. What explains this persistent cultural fascination? Part of the appeal is the mystery itself. Atlantis represents the unknown, the undiscovered, the possibility that there are still great secrets waiting to be revealed about humanity's past. In an age when much of the world has been mapped and explored, when satellites can photograph every corner of the globe, Atlantis offers the romance of the unexplored frontier. The idea that a great civilization could simply vanish without a trace captures the imagination in a way that verified historical facts often do not. Atlantis also serves as a mirror for our own civilization. The story of a great culture that became corrupted by wealth and ambition and was consequently destroyed resonates across time periods. It can be read as a warning about environmental destruction, military overreach, social inequality, or moral decay. Different generations and different cultures have found different meanings in the Atlantis story, adapting it to reflect their own concerns and anxieties. The Atlantis legend also appeals to anti-establishment sentiments and distrust of mainstream institutions. For those who believe that academia and science are hiding the truth about human history, Atlantis becomes a symbol of suppressed knowledge. The idea that there was an advanced ancient civilization that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge allows believers to position themselves as truth seekers standing against a dogmatic establishment. This dynamic has only intensified in the Internet age, where alternative theories about Atlantis proliferate on websites, YouTube channels, and social media platforms. Furthermore, Atlantis represents technological and spiritual utopia. The descriptions of Atlantis at its height portray a civilization that had solved the problems that plague humanity: poverty, conflict, ignorance. The Atlanteans are described as having advanced technology, wise governance, and spiritual enlightenment. The idea that such a civilization once existed offers hope that humanity might achieve such heights again, or alternatively, that we might recover lost ancient wisdom that could solve our modern problems. This utopian dimension of Atlantis makes it appealing to everyone from New Age spiritualists to futurist technologists. Why do people continue to believe in Atlantis despite the lack of scientific evidence? Understanding the psychological factors that drive Atlantis belief can help us understand not just this specific legend, but also the broader phenomenon of belief in pseudo-archaeology and alternative history. One key factor is pattern recognition, a fundamental human cognitive ability that sometimes leads us astray. The human brain is exceptionally good at detecting patterns, which has obvious survival value. But this ability can also cause us to see patterns where none exist, a phenomenon called pareidolia. When people look at ancient sites, geological formations, or satellite images and see evidence of Atlantis, they're often experiencing this tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or natural data. Confirmation bias plays a major role. Once someone believes in Atlantis, they tend to notice and remember evidence that supports their belief while dismissing or forgetting evidence that contradicts it. They might read an article about an underwater archaeological discovery and immediately think of Atlantis, while ignoring dozens of articles about archaeological discoveries that have nothing to do with Atlantis. This bias is particularly strong when people have invested time, money, or social capital in their belief. The Dunning-Kruger effect also contributes to Atlantis belief. This cognitive bias causes people with limited knowledge of a subject to overestimate their understanding of it. Someone who has read a few popular books about Atlantis might feel confident challenging the consensus of professional archaeologists, geologists, and historians who have spent decades studying relevant evidence. The internet has amplified this effect by making it easy for anyone to find information that supports their views and to publish their own theories without peer review. Motivated reasoning is particularly important. People often believe in Atlantis not because of the evidence, but because the belief serves some psychological need. For some, it's the need to feel special, to be part of an enlightened minority that knows truths hidden from the masses. For others, it's the need to believe in a more meaningful universe where ancient mysteries and lost wisdom still exist to be discovered. For still others, it's the need to challenge authority and question mainstream narratives. These emotional and psychological needs can be more powerful than rational evaluation of evidence. The appeal to ancient wisdom is a common theme in Atlantis belief. This is the idea that ancient peoples possessed knowledge or wisdom that has been lost to modern civilization. This belief taps into a broader romantic notion that progress isn't linear, that we may have lost something important as we've gained technological advancement. The idea is comforting in some ways, because it suggests that solutions to our modern problems might lie not in uncertain future developments, but in recovering past knowledge. Conspiracy thinking reinforces Atlantis belief for many people. If mainstream science says Atlantis didn't exist, that must be because scientists are part of a conspiracy to hide the truth. This reasoning is circular and unfalsifiable. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of a cover-up. The more scientists dismiss Atlantis, the more convinced believers become that there must be something to hide. This dynamic is similar to other conspiracy theories and shows how difficult it can be to change minds through evidence and argument. Social identity plays a role as well. Belief in Atlantis can become part of how people define themselves and their community. Online forums, social media groups, and even in-person organizations bring together Atlantis believers who reinforce each other's convictions. Challenging the belief would mean challenging their identity and potentially losing their community, which creates strong psychological resistance to changing one's mind regardless of evidence. It's also worth noting that belief in Atlantis exists on a spectrum. At one end are people who simply find the legend interesting and enjoy speculation about it without making firm commitments about its reality. At the other end are those who are absolutely convinced that Atlantis existed, that evidence for it is being suppressed, and that discovering it would revolutionize human understanding. Most people who engage with Atlantis fall somewhere in between, maintaining a kind of hopeful agnosticism that keeps them open to possibility without firm commitment. Interestingly, belief in Atlantis doesn't correlate strongly with education level or intelligence. Highly educated and intelligent people can believe in Atlantis just as much as those with less education. What seems to matter more is how people think about evidence, how they evaluate sources, and whether they're aware of their own cognitive biases. Critical thinking skills and scientific literacy are better predictors of skepticism about Atlantis than raw intelligence or educational attainment. We know that catastrophic events did occur in the Mediterranean world within the historical memory that might have been preserved in oral tradition. The Thera eruption around 1600 BCE would have been the largest volcanic event in the region in thousands of years. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw the destruction of major civilizations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, from the Hittite Empire to Mycenaean Greece. The Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who attacked the eastern Mediterranean around this time, might have included refugees from disasters whose origins were later forgotten or mythologized. Plato's description of Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules might reflect genuine knowledge of Atlantic islands or even distant lands. Ancient Mediterranean sailors did venture into the Atlantic, and the Phoenicians in particular were renowned for their far-ranging voyages. There are intriguing references in ancient sources to Phoenician voyages to distant islands in the Atlantic, possibly the Canary Islands or even the Azores, though the evidence is ambiguous. Could tales of these voyages, transmitted through multiple generations and cultures, have contributed to Plato's story? The detailed description of Atlantis's capital, with its concentric rings of land and water, is intriguing. Such a specific architectural detail seems oddly concrete for a purely fictional account. Some researchers have wondered whether Plato might have based this description on a real place, perhaps Carthage with its circular harbor, or perhaps some other Mediterranean port city whose layout was known to him. Alternatively, the circular design might be purely symbolic, representing Plato's ideal of geometric perfection and order. The war between Athens and Atlantis in Plato's account could be inspired by real conflicts. Athens did fight wars with various powers in the Mediterranean, most famously with Persia in the Persian Wars of the early 5th century BCE. The description of Athens standing alone against a vast empire and defending Greek freedom might echo this historical experience. Plato could have projected this conflict into the deep past, making it a conflict between his ideal ancient Athens and a fictional Atlantis. Even if we reject the existence of Atlantis as Donnelly imagined it, we can still ask a legitimate historical question. Might Plato have drawn on real historical or geographical knowledge when composing his story? Could there be a kernel of historical truth buried beneath the philosophical allegory? Plato lived in the 4th century BCE, but the Greek world of his time had access to knowledge extending much further back in time. The Greeks traded with Egypt, which had a continuous written history going back more than 2,000 years before Plato's time. Egyptian records and monuments preserved knowledge of ancient kingdoms, wars, and natural disasters. It's entirely plausible that Plato or his sources had access to Egyptian traditions about real historical events, even if those traditions were partially mythologized by the time Plato heard them. The element of sudden catastrophic destruction might reflect knowledge of real disasters. The ancient world experienced numerous earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and floods. Cities and civilizations were occasionally destroyed by natural disasters. The city of Helike in Greece, for example, was destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in 373 BCE, just a few decades before Plato wrote his dialogues. The city sank into the sea and disappeared, creating a contemporary example of exactly the kind of disaster Plato described. Could Helike's destruction have influenced his account? Some scholars have suggested that Plato combined multiple sources: Egyptian traditions about ancient disasters, Greek memories of Bronze Age civilizations, contemporary knowledge of geography beyond the Mediterranean, philosophical ideas about ideal and corrupted states, and perhaps even eyewitness accounts of natural disasters. The result would be a story that contains elements of historical truth woven together with invention, exaggeration, and philosophical allegory. However, we must be careful not to read too much into these possibilities. Ancient writers frequently invented elaborate historical fictions to serve their literary or philosophical purposes. Plato himself invented other dialogues and myths throughout his works, including the myth of air in the Republic and the myth of the charioteer in Phaedrus. These are clearly philosophical allegories, not historical accounts, even though they're presented as if they're true stories. Atlantis might be similar. A carefully crafted fiction that uses realistic details to make it more vivid and engaging, but fiction nonetheless. The fact that Plato provides such specific details like dates, measurements, and genealogies doesn't necessarily mean these details are based on real sources. Ancient writers understood that specificity makes fiction more believable. By giving Atlantis a precise chronology and geography, Plato was following a literary convention, much as modern science fiction writers include technical details to make their invented worlds seem more realistic. The details serve the story's rhetorical purpose regardless of whether they're based on fact. Ultimately, we'll probably never know for certain what sources Plato drew on when creating Atlantis. The Egyptian records he might have consulted are lost, if they ever existed. Oral traditions that might have preserved memories of Bronze Age events are irretrievable. We're left with Plato's text and our attempts to interpret it, which is perhaps exactly what Plato intended. The mystery of Atlantis's sources becomes part of the philosophical exercise, forcing us to think carefully about how we know what we know and what we can legitimately claim about the past. While mainstream science rejects the existence of Atlantis as described in popular theories, legitimate scientific research does engage with questions related to the Atlantis legend. This research focuses not on proving Atlantis existed, but on understanding what might have inspired the story and how ancient civilizations interacted with their environments, particularly catastrophic events. Marine archaeologists study submerged landscapes and settlements from the end of the last ice age. As sea levels rose, many coastal areas were flooded, submerging settlements and creating new coastlines. Research into these drowned landscapes has revealed fascinating evidence of prehistoric human occupation in areas now underwater. While these discoveries don't prove Atlantis existed, they do show that significant human history has been lost to rising seas, and they help us understand how ancient peoples might have experienced and remembered catastrophic flooding. Volcanologists and geologists study ancient eruptions and their impacts on human civilizations. The Thera eruption remains a focus of intensive research, with scientists working to precisely date the eruption, understand its magnitude, and trace its effects across the Mediterranean. This research has shown how volcanic disasters can destroy civilizations and create lasting cultural memories. While researchers aren't trying to prove that Thera was Atlantis, they are interested in how such events might have influenced ancient myths and legends. Climate scientists and archaeologists collaborate to understand how ancient civilizations responded to climate change and natural disasters. The Bronze Age collapse, the end of the Maya Classic period, the fall of various ancient civilizations, all show how environmental stresses can contribute to societal collapse. This research isn't about Atlantis specifically, but it addresses similar themes: how advanced civilizations can fail, how catastrophes are remembered, and how environmental change shapes human history. Classical scholars and philologists study Plato's text in its original context, trying to understand what he intended and what sources he might have used. This involves careful analysis of the language, comparison with other ancient texts, and investigation of what was known about geography and history in Plato's time. This scholarly work treats Atlantis as a text to be understood, not as a place to be found, but it can shed light on the historical and cultural contexts that might have shaped the story. Psychologists and sociologists study why people believe in Atlantis and similar legends. This research examines the cognitive biases, social factors, and psychological needs that drive belief in pseudo-archaeology. Understanding these factors is important not just for understanding Atlantis belief specifically, but for understanding how misinformation spreads and how to promote scientific literacy more broadly. This scientific approach has taught us much about ancient disasters, sea level change, and the resilience and vulnerability of past civilizations. It hasn't found Atlantis, but it has found something perhaps more valuable: real knowledge about human history and our planet's past. The actual story of how ancient civilizations developed, how they were affected by environmental changes, and how they eventually declined or transformed is in many ways more fascinating than the Atlantis legend, because it's real and it's relevant to understanding our own civilization's challenges. Oceanographers continue to map the ocean floor in increasing detail. While they're not looking for Atlantis, this mapping does occasionally reveal surprising underwater features: ancient coastlines, submerged caves, underwater volcanoes, and other geological formations. Some of these features have been misidentified as Atlantis by enthusiasts, but the real scientific value lies in understanding Earth's geological history and the processes that shape the ocean floor. The key distinction between legitimate scientific research and pseudoscientific Atlantology is the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts cherished beliefs. Real scientists studying ancient catastrophes, submerged landscapes, or Bronze Age civilizations don't start with the assumption that Atlantis existed and then look for evidence to support that belief. Instead, they gather evidence systematically, analyze it rigorously, and draw conclusions based on what the evidence actually shows. If the evidence doesn't support Atlantis, they don't claim it does. We've journeyed through more than 2,000 years of Atlantis speculation, from Plato's original philosophical dialogues to modern scientific investigations, from mystical interpretations to cultural adaptations, from serious archaeological theories to outright frauds. What can we conclude about this enduring legend? From a strictly scientific and historical standpoint, Atlantis, as commonly imagined, an advanced continent in the Atlantic Ocean destroyed 11,000 years ago, almost certainly never existed. The geological evidence against it is overwhelming. The archaeological evidence for it is non-existent. Alternative theories that try to identify Atlantis with various real places or events require us to assume that Plato got almost every detail wrong, which raises the question of why we should think he was describing something real at all. The most likely explanation remains that Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical device. The story served his purposes beautifully. It illustrated his ideas about ideal and corrupted states, demonstrated divine justice in operation, and provided a mythical victory for his idealized ancient Athens. Whether he drew on any real historical or geographical knowledge in crafting the story is impossible to determine with certainty, but even if he did, the story as we have it is clearly shaped by his philosophical agenda rather than any concern for historical accuracy. But in another sense, Atlantis is absolutely real. It's real as a cultural phenomenon, as an idea that has captured human imagination for millennia. It's real in its influence on literature, art, film, and popular culture. It's real in the discussions and debates it provokes about ancient history, about how we know what we know, about the relationship between myth and reality. It's real in what it reveals about human psychology, our needs for mystery and meaning, our tendency to see patterns and make connections, our desire for lost golden ages and hidden wisdom. The Atlantis legend endures because it speaks to something deep in the human experience. It's a story about hubris and downfall, about the transience of even the greatest civilizations. In Atlantis, we see our own societies, powerful, prosperous, perhaps growing arrogant, potentially vulnerable to catastrophe. The story warns that wealth and technology without wisdom and virtue lead to destruction. This message resonated with Plato's audience, and it continues to resonate today as we face our own challenges of environmental change, social inequality, and technological power. Atlantis also represents our complicated relationship with the past. We want to believe that ancient peoples were wiser, more advanced, more enlightened than conventional history suggests. This desire reflects a certain dissatisfaction with modernity and a longing for a time when things seemed simpler or more meaningful. Whether such a time ever actually existed is beside the point. The psychological need for it is real, and Atlantis provides a focal point for these feelings. The legend speaks to our love of mystery and the unknown. Even in our hyper-connected, information-saturated world, we crave the possibility of great unsolved mysteries. Atlantis offers the tantalizing suggestion that despite all our satellites, sonar, and scientific instruments, there might still be profound secrets waiting to be discovered. This hope makes the world seem larger and more magical than it might otherwise appear. For some people, belief in Atlantis is also a form of resistance to authority. In an age when experts and institutions are often viewed with suspicion, believing in Atlantis can be a way of asserting independence from mainstream narratives. The fact that scientists and academics dismiss Atlantis becomes, for these believers, a reason to believe in it more strongly. This dynamic is problematic because it can lead people to reject not just the consensus on Atlantis, but scientific consensus more generally, undermining their ability to navigate an increasingly complex world. Yet there's also something valuable in the Atlantis phenomenon, beyond the legitimate question of what might have inspired Plato's story. The enthusiasm and creativity that people bring to Atlantis speculation, even when misguided, reflects genuine curiosity about human history and our place in the world. The challenge is to channel that curiosity toward questions that can actually be answered through evidence and reason, rather than into unfalsifiable claims and circular arguments. The real story of humanity's past, as revealed by archaeology, paleontology, geology, and related sciences, is in many ways more remarkable than the Atlantis legend. The actual development of human civilization from small bands of hunter-gatherers to complex global societies is an epic story of innovation, adaptation, cooperation, and resilience. The real ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and others, achieved remarkable things with the technology and knowledge available to them. Their actual accomplishments don't require us to invoke advanced ancient technology or lost continents. They're impressive precisely because they represent what human beings can achieve through ingenuity and effort. The real catastrophes of the past, the Thera eruption, the floods at the end of the Ice Age, the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the collapse of classic Maya civilization, tell us important things about resilience and vulnerability, about how civilizations respond to environmental stress and internal problems. These real events are worth understanding not as clues to Atlantis, but as lessons about our own civilization's strengths and weaknesses. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Atlantis story, whether we approach it as philosophy, legend, or cautionary tale, is about the consequences of losing touch with our values. Plato's Atlantis fell not because of any external enemy or natural disaster, though those played a role, but because the Atlanteans abandoned the virtue and wisdom that had made them great. They became corrupt, greedy, and imperialistic, and their downfall followed inevitably from this moral decline. The physical destruction was merely the outward manifestation of an inner collapse that had already occurred. This message is particularly relevant today as we face challenges that require not just technological solutions, but moral wisdom. Climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, global inequality, and many others. Like the Atlanteans in Plato's story, we have enormous power and wealth. The question is whether we have the wisdom and virtue to use them well. The fate of Plato's Atlantis suggests what happens when power and wealth are not matched by moral development. So where does this leave us? Atlantis almost certainly never existed as a historical place, at least not in the form described by Plato or imagined by Donnelly and his successors. The scientific evidence against it is simply too strong. But Atlantis exists as something more important than a historical fact. It exists as an idea, a story that reveals truths about human nature, human aspirations, and human vulnerabilities. It's a mirror in which we see ourselves, our hopes and fears about civilization, progress, and the future. The search for Atlantis, at its best, is really a search for understanding. Understanding of the past, understanding of how civilizations rise and fall, understanding of the relationship between myth and history, understanding of ourselves. At its worst, it's a distraction from real history and real problems, a retreat into fantasy that prevents us from engaging with actual evidence and actual challenges. The difference lies in whether we approach the question with intellectual honesty, with a willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, and with an understanding that the absence of evidence for our cherished beliefs might mean those beliefs are wrong. The Atlantis legend will certainly continue to fascinate future generations. New theories will be proposed, new locations suggested, new evidence claimed. The legend is simply too powerful, too resonant, too useful as a blank screen onto which we can project our dreams and anxieties to ever completely fade away. And perhaps that's appropriate. Even if Atlantis never existed, even if it's purely fictional, it serves important functions as entertainment, as philosophical thought experiment, as cautionary tale, as cultural touchstone. The key is to engage with the legend thoughtfully, understanding what we can legitimately claim and what we cannot, recognizing where evidence ends and speculation begins, appreciating both the real history we can discover through science and the mythological dimensions that speak to deeper human truths. We can enjoy the Atlantis legend in fiction, explore its philosophical dimensions, consider what might have inspired it, and use it as a lens through which to examine our own civilization, all without needing to believe that it was a literal historical fact. In the end, the entire story of Atlantis is the story of how humans make meaning from the past, how we use stories to understand ourselves and our world, how we balance skepticism and wonder, evidence and imagination. It's a story about the power of narrative, the persistence of myth, the methods of science, and the eternal human quest to understand where we came from and where we might be going. Whether or not Atlantis ever existed, that story is worth telling, and it will continue to be told as long as humans wonder about the mysteries of the past and the possibilities of the future. Thank you for joining me on this comprehensive journey through the entire story of Atlantis. From Plato's original philosophical dialogues to modern scientific investigations, from mystical interpretations to popular culture, we've explored every major aspect of this enduring legend. Whether you believe Atlantis was real or purely fictional, whether you see it as lost history or philosophical allegory, I hope this exploration has given you a deeper appreciation for why this story has captivated humanity for over 2 millennia, and why it will likely continue to do so for millennia to come.